Hello everybody, I have Roger here. Scarlett's here too. She just laid down right here. So we're back with weeks 7 and 8 of the Great War. Alright, as usual, we're going to jump into comment time before we get into today's video, and if you guys haven't seen the last video on weeks 5 and 6, I'll link it up here. You might want to go check it out first. But let's go ahead and let's take a look at some of your comments. Flying Eagle says, no reason to feel bad about not knowing these things mentioned in Indy's videos. Most of it is in far greater detail than would be found in history courses, other than those who typically or specifically study World War I in great detail. And he goes on to talk about how like history books might just mention, you know, maybe give 1 or 2 sentences to a particular historical event, which was proven true. I did a video recently showing you guys like a middle school history textbook, and it made very, very little mention of a lot of things. So I guess that's just kind of the way you have to teach world history in a lot of ways. You have to leave a lot of stuff out. So yeah, it's kind of like sad in a way, but yeah, I mean, I guess I've never really studied World War I in detail, so I guess it makes sense that I wouldn't have learned a lot of this stuff in school. John Smith says, I see Indy has decided to release the Great War's first expansion pack this week, featuring the addition of Japan, British Dominion troops, and the Royal Navy as the new playable factions. Unfortunately, I foresee many more expansion packs and DLC along the way over the next few years. I just like that comment. It definitely is like getting a little bit more complicated the further that we get into this. Shane Prosser says, I'm a Brit, and the simple fact is Europe is relatively small with lots of different nationalities and history. These two things means our wars tend to get brutal fast and they tend to drag other nations in. Well, I guess if you really think about it like that, then these world wars probably make a lot of sense, and also, you know, a lot of the conflict in Europe in the past. Gofili says Hindenburg was a Zeppelin, a rigid frame airship in contrast to blimps. Yes, airship is what I was trying to think about saying last time. I was like, it's not a blimp, but it kind of is like one. Yeah, I do remember learning about the Zeppelin, and I remember seeing actually footage. I think there's footage of it crashing, right? Or blowing up or something. Hinger, I don't know how, I don't even know what that is. That an L? The Pacific Theater of War, World War I wasn't that significant, but it's understandable that you haven't heard of it. The German Empire had a bunch of colonies in the area, but only one of them had a significant military presence. See, I don't know about the German Empire and the German colonies. Yes, the whole, like, the colonial stuff, I'm, like, barely aware of it. I know Britain had a lot of colonies. Spain, there's Spanish Empire that I've learned watching these videos, you know, having a bunch of colonies. The Dutch now, and, of course, the US has had some. Yeah, the German Empire, I didn't know that Germany had colonies in the Pacific, so man. Grophilia again. After the Napoleonic Wars, Europe had enjoyed a piece of relative peace. Also, there was a certain mindset about civilized warfare. War would always affect the civilians, but it wasn't to be fought against them. Fighting should be left to the soldiers. Of course, it didn't work out that way. There were a lot of other people that mentioned that the civilians fired upon the soldiers, which kind of instigated a lot of the I guess brutality towards them as well. I guess if you factor that in, I guess it kind of makes sense why the soldiers were like that with civilians, but still, it's just none of it was good. Google account. I don't even know how you got that username. The 21st century is an anomaly of peace. I think that is kind of a summary of what I was trying to say in the last video. I've lived in a time of relative peace, I guess, compared to like times when world wars were going on. Obviously, there have been conflicts, even some that the US has been involved in my lifetime, but nothing on the scale of world wars. That's why I suppose it's really, really hard for me to think of such a thing happening in our lifetime, because that's just not been the reality of, you know, the world in my lifetime. But I totally understand that it could happen again. Like, I'm not saying that it wouldn't happen again, but I guess I've just been living in sort of as a bubble of peace compared to the rest of history, I suppose. And that's been my view of the world. So to think of it being something completely different from that is, for me, it's just something that existed in history. But yeah, I think it would be very, very naive to think that it couldn't happen again. Blame Than says, don't forget that there have been war crimes in Europe in your lifetime in the Balkans in the 1990s, which I remember at the time people saying felt like the clock had been turned back to the 1910s when Yugoslavia broke up. Yeah, I guess that kind of goes to the point where there have been conflicts in my lifetime, but they've been relatively isolated like that. I do remember stuff going on in the Balkans, and that's why I thought that the Crimean War took place in the 90s, even though I know Crimea is not part of the Balkans, I don't think. I associated it with like those countries for whatever reason. And I remember as a kid hearing about stuff going on in like Kosovo, and I think the US was involved in stuff over there, but again, like I don't know what was going on or why we were involved. Maybe it was NATO that was involved, I don't know. But yeah, I was too young to really understand what was going on or to really care. Honestly, I don't know, as a kid you tend to be kind of oblivious to politics and world affairs and stuff, and if they happen you don't really understand what's going on, and so that's kind of what was going on with me in the Balkans at that time, I guess. So I guess I should learn more about that. Hans Lasser says some historians consider that both world wars were in fact one long war with 20-year halftime. I think that World War I is not taught enough as it shaped world history. I'd probably agree with that first part right there. That's also a really interesting way to look at it. A couple of other people also kind of gave that same comment, that World War I and World War II were just kind of like two halves of the same war. I think that there's some merit to that, probably. Okay, so that's gonna do it for comment time. We'll jump into weeks 7 and 8 here. Week 7 is titled The First Battle of the Marne? I don't know where that is, because I'm gonna be learning a ton just right off the bat here. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at week 7, then we'll get right into week 8. We'll just kind of have them back to back, okay?
The first 5 weeks of the war have seen great offensives by Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, larger than any military operations in history. Hundreds of thousands of men have died, but today, all of those offensives come to an end.
Okay, wasn't expecting that.
I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. At the beginning of the week, the French and the British were regrouping around Paris as the Germans advanced. The Germans were also advancing in the east, hoping to push the Russians back to Russia, while further south, it was the Russians advancing to push the Austrians back toward their own empire. 2 weeks ago, a Russian army had been absolutely destroyed at the Battle of Tannenberg, and though the Germans had been trying to press their advantage, there hadn't been a major battle since then. That changed this week. On the morning of September 9th, the German army, bolstered by troop arrivals from the front in France, attacked the Russians and once again simply crushed them at the Masurian Lakes, and the Russian army only escaped complete and total destruction by the remarkable speed of its retreat from the lakes, moving 40 kilometers a day to leave the Germans far behind.
Oh my gosh.
These two battles, especially Tannenberg, were truly historical victories, and they pushed all Russian troops off of German soil. They also destroyed Russian numerical superiority over the Germans for the time being. Now, Russia would still have a strong presence just across the border, but the Germans were no longer worried about being steamrolled by the endless Russian army. Here's a little anecdote from the retreat. Now, some Russian soldiers were trying to take a statue of Bismarck from a town in East Prussia to bring home, but their commander told them not to take it because he did not want there to be an international incident. Now, the Russian people as a whole
it's already a
totally
national
demoralized
incident
by the catastrophic defeats they had suffered against Germany had they not beaten Austria-Hungary nearly as badly in the Battle of Galicia, which also ended September 11th. Now, this was a group name for a series of battles over several weeks during Austria's offensive into Russian territory. These battles ended with Russia taking 130,000 prisoners and inflicting 324,000 Austrian casualties. Yes, you heard that right, 324,000.
Oh my gosh.
You see, the Austrian army, under Chief of Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf, had attacked with a much smaller force than the Russians had, and the failure was actually due more to Austrian incompetence than to Russian brilliance. The Austrian army was forced to retreat 160 kilometers toward the Carpathian Mountains. Conrad's failure and humiliation were now total. And remember, there were perhaps only 1 or 2 people on Earth who bear more responsibility for the beginning of World War I and all the carnage that was to follow than Conrad von Hotzendorf. Another side note here. At one point, a bit down the road, Conrad confessed to his staff that if Archduke Franz Ferdinand was still alive, he would take the man responsible for such military disaster, Conrad himself, and have him shot. It was also this week that saw the Pact of London, when France, Britain, and Russia agreed that none of them would make a separate peace with Germany or Austria-Hungary. They would fight to the end. In the Western Front, it seemed like it might well be the end. The Germans had advanced toward Paris for 2 weeks, and the final battle of that offensive was approaching. Now, as the Germans neared Paris, the French were finally gaining a bit of an advantage. In spite of their massive losses the past 3 weeks, they had a newly recruited and newly formed army, while the exhausted Germans had been advancing for 33 straight days. Also, the Germans had followed the retreating British not to Paris, but just to the northeast and south of the River Marne, overextending their supply lines and losing the chance to take Paris, which was the major goal of their battle plan, the Schlieffen Plan. So it was south of the Marne that the British and French prepared to do battle. The Battle of the Marne began on September 5th, 1914, a battle that the French and the British could absolutely not afford to lose. Over 2 million troops were engaged in this battle. The French used the railways to constantly take up new positions and outmaneuver the Germans. This might not have been such a big problem if the Germans had better communications, but von Moltke, the German Army Chief of Staff, was at Koblenz, over 500 kilometers away, and he practiced a system of decentralization where his generals often just did what they saw best. Moltke was also very high-strung, and by this point, he was talking.
Somebody told me in the World at War series that I'm watching on Patreon that that's the way Hitler managed his army or his military as well. It was a very decentralized thing to try and keep a military coup from happening against him. So that's interesting to hear too.
Was talking to himself and writing letters to his wife where he would freak out about the amount of blood being shed and the feeling that he must personally answer to it. It's pretty amazing when you realize that the Germans had actually got this far when their generals often had no idea what the other generals were doing. During the entire Battle of the Marne,
so weird.
Moltke and the German High Command issued no orders at all, and the last 2 days didn't even receive any. The Germans had 2 armies here, and the western one, under General von Bülow, had been forced to make a new north-south line facing Paris to defend against French advances, right? Von Bülow moved troops from his left to his right to counterattack, but this counterattack opened up a gap between von Bülow and the Eastern Army under von Kluck, and standing before that gap was the British Expeditionary Force, who cautiously advanced. Von Bülow's army was now cut off from von Kluck's, with communications almost non-existent. This is where the taxi legends come in. As the French surged and the Germans reinforced, the French general Joseph Gallieni did something that he quoted as, at least out of the ordinary, and indeed it was something nobody had ever done before. Gallieni requisitioned all the Paris taxicabs to shuttle reserves 50 kilometers from the city to the front. Now, the automobile was still in its infancy, and this was over 400 cars, a huge amount for the time, and most of the soldiers had never had the luxury of riding in an automobile. 2 things, though. The actual impact of this on the battle was quite modest, and the taxi drivers were paid. Their meters were running the entire time.
Wow.
On September 8th, the battle, and you could argue the whole war, and even the whole 20th century, hung in balance. Attack and counterattack all across the line, and it was simply a question of who would crack first. It was a night attack on the 8th, when the French captured Marchay-en-Brie, that really turned the tide. When von Bülow fought back, the gap between his army and von Kluck's grew to 30 kilometers. He was outnumbered. The British were now well into the gap, and in the wee hours, von Bülow gave the order to retreat. At 9:02 a.m. on September 9th, 1914, the German forces began to withdraw. On September 9th, the Germans were driven back across the Marne, and on the 13th across the Aisne, a total retreat of 100 kilometers. And it was there, on a ridge, that the German troops dug in. And we now see one of the unsung military advances of the war, the spade in action. The Germans used it, the French did not. So the Germans could dig in, not so the French. And there's no telling how many thousands of Frenchmen were lost to the German advance because of such a simple tool. See, a man in a hole is impossible for artillery to spot, and he can't be shot by a rifle, and hand grenades would require close contact. For many Frenchmen, though, using such a defense was a dishonorable means of conducting a battle. They would soon learn that honor had no place in modern warfare. That modern warfare had now cost close to 1 million lives in only 5 weeks. And during the first few months of the war, an average of over 15,000 lives were lost every day. On September 14th, a shattered Moltke was removed from the German command. He had, in the end, found the casualties unbearable. And looking at the few orders he did issue the last 2 weeks of his command, you can see him slowly falling to pieces, but it's hard to have sympathy for him. No man on earth, not even Conrad, had done more to bring about the war than Moltke, but he proved incapable of commanding his nation's armies. 3 great offensives were over this week, and much of the pattern was set for the rest of the war. I'm going to end today's episode with a quote from the historian Martin Gilbert to tell you how. Denied their triumphal entry into Paris, the German army would go on fighting on the Western Front for another 4 years, as hopeful of victory in August 1918 as they had been in August 1914. But the hopes of a month earlier, of being able to defeat France in a knockout blow and then turn all their military strength against Russia, had been dashed. The war of rapid victories had become a strategy of the past and a dream for the future. Germany was going to have to fight simultaneously and with constant danger in both East and West. France was going to have to fight on French soil. Russia was going to have to regain land in the West, and Austria to regain land in the East. Christmas was still 3.5 months away, but every warring state was going to have to search for new strategies and even new allies. September 18th, 1914. This week, we see the mobile and fast-paced war of the past 6 weeks turning into something never imagined that would prove more sinister and deadly than even the bloodiest battles of the war's beginning. This week began the war in the trenches. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. At the beginning of the week, the Germans were retreating from the Marne River, having been stopped by the French and the British, but they were far from beaten. While on the Eastern Front, the Austro-Hungarian army was in disarray, retreating from the advancing Russians and seemingly on the verge of collapse. Here's what happened next. On September 13th, there was a meeting in France at General Joseph Joffre's headquarters. Joffre had been in large part responsible for the French disasters of August, but was now getting a lot of credit for the successes of September. The meeting was full of optimism, and what was being discussed was how long it would take to push the Germans back across their own border. Some thought 4 weeks, some thought only 3. Once again, people were talking of a war that would be over by Christmas. However, in practical terms, the French were running low on ammunition and were not really able to exploit the German retreat. And though the British were also advancing, they were advancing very slowly. As for the Germans, their brand new chief of staff, Erich Falkenhayn, former Prussian Minister of War, was a shot in the arm after his predecessor's nervous collapse. And on September 13th, a bloody month of fighting began as the Germans stopped their retreat on what is one of the best defensive positions in France, the Aisne River. The river itself is about 30 meters wide, with flat, low-lying ground stretching out for nearly 2 kilometers on either side with no possibility of concealment. Then there's suddenly a ridge over 100 meters high that levels off to a plateau. The Germans dug in on the north side of the river, a couple of miles from the ridge in a dense forest, but commanding a huge field of fire. That night, the British crossed the river and advanced under a heavy fog. But in the morning, the fog cleared and they were raked with fire and suffered heavy losses. By that morning of September 14th, though, they were established on the northern bank of the Aisne, but the troops were in a terrible state. Many hadn't eaten for days, and they were soaked, exhausted, and overlooked along the entire line by the German army. Not good.
What?
But for the next 4 weeks, they gamely struggled to mount the ridge while the Germans tried
Wait,
to
what?
but overlooked along the entire line by the German army.
Okay, so the British managed to cross the river and they're on, I guess, the same side as the Germans, but they're kind of hanging out below the ridge. And the Germans are just ignoring them? Is that what he's saying here? Did the British also know that the Germans were there? Or did they kind of get surprised by the Germans firing down on them? That just seems like a really, really difficult... Well, I was going to say, it seems like a really bad idea to... It seems like you would be trapped kind of there. But you know what? We did the same stuff on D-Day and everything, going into a really bad situation. And I guess you just hope that your numbers can eventually overcome the defense of the Germans or whatever. But it's interesting.
Army. Not good. But for the next 4 weeks, they gamely struggled to mount the ridge while the Germans tried to drive them back to the river. Despite thousands of casualties each day on both sides, neither succeeded. Nobody was planning on retreating, though. And on September 14th, 1914, British Commander John French gave the first orders for the British to entrench. The Germans were digging in as well, and this was the beginning of trench warfare. See, the Battle of the Aisne was the start of something different. The British troops who fought there reported that it was far worse than earlier battles at Mons or Les Cateaux, for the simple reason that the battle was so interminably long. And this was very much the nature of the new style of warfare. Battles no longer lasted an afternoon, but could go on uninterrupted for weeks, with artillery barrages lasting for hours and hours. The only way for a man to survive in this war was to make himself invisible, digging himself into the ground. Nobody was really prepared for digging trenches, though. The Germans had spades, which they used to dig small holes for individuals when under artillery fire. But
what's a spade? I feel like he didn't explain what that is. He just threw it out there, and you're supposed to know what that is. If he said it, in a previous video, I don't remember. So, you guys, I'm assuming it's a shovel or a machine or something to dig trenches, obviously, but
had spades, which they used to dig small holes for individuals when under artillery fire. But the German equipment was all designed to fit German battle plans, which involved a highly mobile war that could be won in a matter of weeks. They did adapt fairly quickly, though, producing things like rifle grenades and converting things like periscopes and flares for trench warfare. Initially, the trenches were not connected in trench lines and were not particularly deep, but they soon became more and more advanced. Frontline troops would live in underground dorms with storehouses that were built into the wall facing the enemy so they couldn't be shelled. There were communication trenches, backup trenches in case of retreat, eventually a whole network across the entire front with...
Oh my gosh, I didn't know that they were this elaborate. I mean, of course, I've seen movies of like World War I trenches, and they have like even bedrooms and stuff, kind of like built into them and everything. A kitchen, I mean, obviously very primitive, but oh my gosh, the effort that has to go into making these things, and then you don't get anywhere. This kind of warfare just baffles me. I guess that they were just so caught off guard with kind of the newer technology. They didn't really know how to fight against it. And so this is the best thing that they could come up with, I guess, on the fly, maybe. But this is just... I mean, if you dig in like this, then nobody's going to make any progress, it seems like. Like, what's even the point of that at that point? Man.
With enemies that were often only 100 meters apart. Commander French described the suddenly new situation on September 16th as a stalemate in our favor. But he realized and said even then that in this war, a spade was as useful as a rifle. But stalemate it was in the West, as the battle raged on day after day for a month. The weather was abysmal, and spirits on both sides were at a low. But think how much lower they may have been had they known that the front at which they were fighting would remain virtually unchanged for the next 4 years. In the East, though, it was anything but a stalemate. By September, the Germans realized they had to do something to save Austria-Hungary's bacon. German General Ludendorff went to visit the Austrian Army Chief of Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf. Now, Konrad was one of the chief architects of the whole war, though he proved to be a terrible leader. But still, he managed to convince Ludendorff that the Austrian army was in such a terrible state because they'd been holding off the Russians so the Germans could tackle the French. Konrad's army was indeed in a terrible state. They'd already lost 500,000 men, 100,000 of them captured, and the army was shutting itself into the fortress of Przemysl on the slopes of the Carpathians with 120,000 men.
Okay, so I have a question. They're talking about these mass casualties, like 1 million soldiers died in the first 5 weeks of this. They're talking about 500,000 Austrians dead. We're in weeks, well, I guess week 8 here. How and why exactly? Why are these casualties mounting up this quickly in this war? Is it literally because of the mismatch between war tactics and the new technology that they've got? They're not fighting very smartly. They don't know how to fight against the new artillery, new guns, all of that stuff. And so they're using, or is it the old tactics against the new technology? Is that what's causing all of these casualties like this? Because it's just insane to me.
Now, you'd think it would have collapsed as all the other fortresses did to modern artillery, but the mud was too thick there for the Russians to get artillery into place. The war in the East, though, was really a logistical catastrophe. The spaces to cover were just so large and communications were so awful. And then the autumn rains came and turned everything to mud. There weren't enough railways, and there were just too many men to supply. In some units, in fact, only the men in the very front had rifles, and you had to wait until someone was killed before you could get one. But they had men, certainly Russia did, men by the millions. Over in the West, though, one of the main British problems had been that her army was very small compared to those of France or Germany. But Britain had just engaged in one of the most famous advertising campaigns in history. And on September 12th, Britain announced that in only 6 weeks, 478,000 men had volunteered. She had managed.
Okay, so this must be where the U.S. got that Uncle Sam Needs You poster, because obviously that's very famous over here in the U.S., and I didn't know that, I mean, I'm assuming that it was copied from this, but I didn't know that. I thought it was just an original American invention, you know, as we tend to believe over here with a lot of things. So it's interesting. So the Brits came up with that slogan, or that type of campaign, basically, and then we just basically inserted Uncle Sam in the place of this soldier, whoever this is, and kind of, I think we might have changed up the wording slightly, but it's basically the same thing that we have on our posters here. Uncle Sam Needs You, I think is what it said. So that's really interesting.
Advertising campaigns in history. And on September 12th, Britain announced that in only 6 weeks, 478,000 men had volunteered. She had managed to raise an army without any of the mandatory...
What is going on with these guys right here? So I'm assuming this is like a training camp, and then we have all of these Brits back here in their suits, just like laughing at these guys. And the guy in charge is also laughing. Oh my gosh.
1,000 men had volunteered. She had managed to raise an army without any of the mandatory service the Continental armies all used. However, there were some issues with that army. Professional British soldiers despaired of the quality of the new units, going so far as to call them ridiculous and pointing out that it had taken the Germans 40 years of hard work and conscription to create their army. One curiosity of the new recruits is that they were mostly formed of PALS battalions, which were entirely people from the same town or the same profession.
Okay, so if any of you have watched my P.O. Box opening videos in the past, you guys know that I got this this book called The Chorley Pals from one of my viewers, and it has, this is exactly what he's talking about here, and I didn't know what this was at all before he sent it. But it's got just like a ton of basically personal stories of the different soldiers that fought in these, well, I guess that were included in the Chorley Pals anyway. It would be fun to integrate this into some videos as we go through this. I don't know how I would do that exactly, but I might have to give it a little bit of a give it some thought on that. I don't know, maybe I should make my own original videos on the Charlie Pals. That might be interesting. Okay, we'll get back to this.
Pals battalions, which were entirely people from the same town or the same profession. Now this led to a little side note. The British didn't think at the time that without units being geographically mixed, the entire male population of a whole town could be wiped out in a day in a single battle. They would learn this the hard way. Rarely has a mood changed in war as quickly as it did on the Western Front this week in 1914. At the beginning of the week, optimism was high in the British and French armies as the Germans retreated from the Marne. But this was before the armies all reached the Aisne. Entrenchment began, and the war of weeks-long, continuous battles and bombardments began. What we see by the end of the week is that the quality and ingenuity of the armies was increasing, even as the death toll mounted. But in spite of all the new advances designed to give an advantage, none was gained by either side, and the war of rapid victories was over for good. The excruciating, stagnant war in the mud had begun on both the Western and Eastern fronts. It would remain in the mud for the next 4 years.
Alright, well, I thought that this was a really, really good setup for the rest of the war. It's good to have that context in knowing that this was kind of the start of that trench warfare that he's talking about, or that's so famous from World War I. How things just kind of stagnate here. Because I said that, like, when I saw the trenches and saw how they were starting to do this, it's like when you entrench yourself and you don't like come out of the trench to go and kind of charge at the enemy, like you're not gonna make any progress in the war. So it's just like, man, this must have been like a super frustrating war to fight in for the soldiers, because I mean you would just kind of feel stuck. And also like the technology and just how that's affecting everything versus the tactics. Hopefully he'll get more into that, but I'm assuming that that's also driving a lot of this as well, and driving the casualty numbers, these huge casualty numbers. But yeah, I could definitely see how this is going to unfold way differently than World War II. And I know that I was making, you know, some comparisons between the two with some of the stuff towards the beginning of all of this, but I can see now how this is very quickly going to diverge, or at least it seems like it's going to diverge from World War II here, because it is a completely different war in a completely different time, different technology, different tactics, all of that stuff. I can see how World War II just made so many more advances from all of this. Now, of course, we're just at the very beginning here, so it'll be interesting to see what happens from 1914 to 1918 and what changes in that time span. Anyway, 2 really good videos back to back today. Hope you guys enjoyed it too. Please answer my questions down in the comments as you always do. I really appreciate that. Also, if you enjoyed this video and you enjoy my videos in general, I'd appreciate a like and a subscribe. And you can find all of my social media, Discord, Patreon links down in the description or the pinned comment if you're interested in that stuff. Roger here, and I thank you guys for watching. As always, stay tuned for weeks 9 and 10 coming up shortly on my channel, and we will see you next time.